Welcome, everybody, to this fourth presentation in the series Cosmology and Christ, reading the letter to the Colossians and the Ephesians. I'll go straight to the slides to take us through this presentation. So we have been looking at our worldview in the first presentation with the new cosmology and the influence of evolution on philosophical and religious thinking. We went back in time to the worldview of the first century, potential worldviews, possible backgrounds to the thoughts and images in Colossians and Ephesians. In the third presentation, we looked at the letter itself, its context, its authorship, its style, and some of its teaching. And now we come to the hymn in chapter 1, verses 15 to 20. And for the presentation, we use the following sequence: the hymn itself to read it, the literary setting, possible backgrounds, layout and structure, some New Testament foreground, commentary, questions for reflection, a task, and the next step. So here's our passage from Colossians 1, 15 to 20. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For all things in heaven and on earth were created in him, all things, whether visible or invisible, whether thrones or dominions, whether principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and all things are held together in him. He is the head of the body, the church, as well as the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself may become first in all things. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in the Son, and through him to reconcile all things to himself by making peace through the blood of his cross, through him, whether things on earth or things in heaven. So a wonderful text, familiar. At the same time, it takes a bit of effort to understand what's being said here. First of all, there's an immediate literary setting. The thought unit is contained in verses 3 to 23 as follows. It's marked, first of all, by an inclusion, that's to say, a repetition at the beginning and the end. So at the very beginning, in verses 4 to 6, we hear of faith, hope, gospel, and growing in the world. And in verse 23, faith, hope, gospel, proclaimed to every creature under heaven. And the unit follows a sequence. There's a thanksgiving, verses 3 to 8, an intercession, 9 to 14, that breaks into our hymn of praise, 15 to 20, and its application, 21 to 23. As always, a single paragraph should be read in the context of its whole literary setting. There are many possible backgrounds. It's possibly a ruminating reflection, a midrash on the first words of the book of Genesis. Certainly, second Adam imagery is present, already present in the historical Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 5, with this big difference that here it teaches the pre-existence of the second Adam. In Jewish thought of the time, very influenced by Greek philosophy, some kind of mediator of creation is also a possibility. And we may even have here an early Christian Passover hymn, because it mentions the events of redemption. What is sure is that there's a wisdom background, and that's apparent in each verse. For instance, in verse 15, it talks about the firstborn of all creation, something already in Proverbs, Sirach, and Wisdom. In verse 16, in him all things were created. In Wisdom, in her all things were created. So in Proverbs, Sirach, and the Book of Wisdom. In verse 17, he is before all things. That's just like Wisdom was in Proverbs and Sirach. Verse 19, fullness. That's found also in Proverbs, Baruch, and Sirach. And reconciliation is also found in Wisdom 10, 1 to 12, 17. So it's quite a strong wisdom, sapiential background to this passage here. What's missing from the wisdom traditions would be a reference to the goal, that is, to the cross and resurrection, and to the end of time, of course. That's a particularly Christian addition to the whole pattern. Now, the text is certainly poetic or elevated prose, and different scholars have attempted different layouts to make sense of the passage. And the important thing here is to notice that each proposed layout notices different real things about the text, so we can learn from every proposal. We don't have to choose just one, because they're all varied and rich. And in any case, poetry is always greater than such detailed analysis. That said, the detailed analysis can help us to spot things that we might not otherwise have noticed. For example, there's a proposal that we should read this passage in terms of two stanzas, and they match. Verse 15a, the one who is, in 18b, the one who is, verse 15b, the firstborn, 18c, firstborn, 16a, because in him, and 19, because in him. And you can see there, it's to do with creation and redemption. Another proposal is that we should see here three stanzas. That's verses 15 to 16, Christ as creator, 17 to 18a, Christ as preserver, and 18b to 20, Christ as redeemer. I'm going to show you a slightly more elaborate version of the three stanza approach because it just helps us to spot things in the text itself. Now in this proposal, I've put in a different color in green what might be editorial adjustments. So I'll read it. Who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for in him all things were created, all things in heaven and on earth, things visible and invisible, with the possible addition of whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, perhaps to deal with the Colossian heresy. A transitional strophe, 2, about Christ as the preserver. All things were created through him and for him, and he himself is before all things, and all things hold together in him, and he himself is the head of the body, with the possible addition of the word church here to bring it into the reality of the Colossians. And the third strophe, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, taking us the events of redemption, perhaps adding, so that he himself might have preeminence in all things, again against the Colossian heresy. For in him all the fullness was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things for him, making peace through him, through the blood of his cross, possibly added immediately after the word peace, whether things on earth or things in heaven. And you can see that it makes us, the pattern makes a certain amount of sense. This is a potential reconstruction with potential editorial adjustments. Naturally, we're in the realm of the possible and the hypothetical, and it may well be that the actual hymn shows an even more complex pattern, a concentric structure on the lines of A, B, C, B, A, which we'll now take a look at. People have noticed that the poetry can be viewed as a section A, a section B, a B apostrophe, and an A apostrophe. And in the center is a kind of section C, and all things through him hold together. Now, some scholars have seen a much more elaborate form of that, which we'll take a quick look at without delaying too much, but here it is. And you see here, we have a concentric pattern with an unusual rhythm. There is the large concentric pattern, that's to say X, Y, Z, repeat at the bottom in a different order, X, Z, Y, and in the center, B, C, B, apostrophe. And this is the writer who produces this has certainly noticed real things in the text. So we'll take a look at that. I'm just going to mark different sections to make it super clear. For instance, we could notice that section X and X apostrophe really do resemble each other. A quick glance will show you that. Our second section Y and section Y apostrophe also belong together. And things in the heavens and upon the earth, and the bottom, whether things on earth or things in heaven. A little more elaborate in the first one. And then you have section Z, all things were created through him and for him, and section Z below, and through him, and to reconcile all things to himself, making peace through the blood of his cross. And that all, they also belong together. And then finally, in the center you have, and he is before all things, and all things through him hold together, and he is the head of the body, the church. And if such a pattern is valid, then you can always ask the question, is the piece in the physical center the meaning center? And it seems to me that that's correct here. BC, B asterisk, B apostrophe, that really is the center of this little reflection or poem here, which has, you can see, a quite elaborate rhythm or movement. Not perfect. As I said earlier, the different people who analyze this see different patterns, and from all the different patterns, we learn something about the richness and complexity of this short poem. There's some New Testament foreground as well. Wisdom Christology is also found in Hebrews, and of course in John, and in the book of Revelation. And wisdom is certainly in the context of Colossians here. And in the exhortation, how to live wisely is described also in Colossians. So wisdom is very much part of what we're looking at here. And here's a terrific example of wisdom Christology from the letter to the Hebrews, also a late New Testament document. After God spoke long ago in various portions and in various ways to our ancestors through the prophets, in these last days he has spoken to us in a Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, and through whom he created the world. The Son is the radiance of his glory and the representation of his essence, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. And so when he had accomplished cleansing for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And already, even at a first glance, you can see parallels between the sentiment here and what's written in Colossians 1:15 to 20. We read in Colossians just before our passage, "For this reason we also from the day we heard about you have not ceased praying for you and asking God to fill you with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding." So sapiential writing. And in Colossians 2:2, "My goal is that their hearts, having been knit together in love, may be encouraged, and that they may have all the riches that assurance brings in their understanding of the knowledge of the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge." And the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are anticipated in Colossians 1:15 to 20. I can't help going back again to Raymond Brown's comment quoted in the first presentation. This is a short reflection of his in his introduction to the New Testament. And if you don't mind, I'll read it again because I find it very powerful. The Colossians hymn professes that Christ Jesus is the image of the invisible God, God's Son, in whom all things were created, in whom all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through whom all things were reconciled to God. How within 50 years at the latest did Christians come to believe that about a Galilean preacher who was crucified as a criminal? Like the other New Testament hymns, Colossians 1:15 to 20 offers a challenge to understanding the development of New Testament Christology. Given the fact that most scholars judge hymns in the Pauline letters to be pre-Pauline or non-Pauline in origin, one should note where high Christological statements in those hymns are similar to statements in the prose of the undisputed letters. For example, compare Colossians 1:16 and 1 Corinthians 8:6. So powerful reflection from the great Raymond Brown. So we'll take a moment then to reflect more closely on the text itself, and we'll take it verse by verse. So in Colossians 1:15 we read, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation." And the word for image there is icon, the one who makes the invisible God visible. And this is certainly part of Pauline language, where Jesus is the image of saved humanity as it was meant to be. The special edition of Colossians is we're moving back from salvation to creation. There's a kind of logic. If Christ is also the image of God, then he must also always have been so. So we go back to a kind of first Adam, really. And so the second Adam existed before the first Adam, a little mild paradox in the Christology of this letter. The roots of this teaching are already to be found in wisdom literature, as we saw, especially Wisdom 7:26. And just as wisdom was seen as God present, immanent in creation, Christ was both sovereign and first within creation and the divine agent of creation, a remarkable sentiment from 1 Colossians 1:15. The language of firstborn likewise combines creation and salvation. In wisdom writing, wisdom was also called first, and in Philo of Alexandria, she's even called the firstborn. And firstborn points simply not to chronology, but also to status or standing or authority, as in Psalm 89:27. Firstborn, significantly, is also resurrection language, found in Paul, as you see there on the text in Romans 8:29, also in Revelation 1:5. The risk of this firstborn language and image language is that it can make the Son sound somehow subordinate to the Father, an attitude picked up by the later Arian heresy, but rejected by early orthodoxy in the church councils. In Colossians 1:16 we read, "For all things in heaven and on earth were created in him," and the English translation repeats all here, all things, whether visible or invisible, whether thrones or dominions, whether principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. So all things is in there twice in Greek to give a very comprehensive presentation. And we notice the prepositions in, through, and for, equally important for the role of Christ in creation and redemption. The interruption, the long list of whether visible or invisible, is meant to give the two dimensions of reality, the spiritual and the earthly, in order to be fully comprehensive, and also perhaps to oppose the Colossian heresy. And the invisible includes the cosmic powers, also subordinate to Jesus. And it may well be possible that some people in the Colossian community were giving far too much significance to these cosmic powers. And each of the four representative names here, as thrones, dominions, principalities, powers, also mentioned in early Jewish documents such as 2nd Enoch, and where the seventh rank heaven angels are set in rank. That's also found in 2nd Maccabees and 1 Enoch and the Testament of Levi. Here these powers are evidently benign, but in verse 20 they are hostile and in need of reconciliation. The prepositions are really important here, in, through, and for. But this is in partly a straightforward echo of wisdom, because wisdom was also in and through creation. But the word for takes us to a new dimension beyond the wisdom tradition. The whole cosmos is not simply in and through Christ, but put in place for his sake, for the revelation and glorification of Christ. And this is innovative, an addition to the wisdom tradition, and of course, very arresting. And something similar is said in verse 20 at the end. Verse 17, he himself is before all things, and all things are held together in him. This is a quick summary of verse 15 and verse 19 that verse 16 that we just saw. And Christ resembles wisdom, or Sophia, created before all things, and the gift of prudent understanding from eternity, as in Sirach 1:4. But also Christ resembles the Logos, the Word. Because we read also in Sirach, written in Greek, by his word all things hold together. So the one involved in creation is also the one who sustains it and who prevents it from falling into chaos and into nothingness. And the word to hold or are held is synistemi or synistano, and has a very wide range of meanings, which I'll give. To put together, to fit together, to introduce, to make known, to display, to prove to be, to come together, to hold together, to unite, to be composed of, to consist of, and to have existence in. And the meaning here is evidently to hold together, the sustainer. And in Stoic and in Hellenistically influenced cosmology, the world is understood as divided into constituent individual elements, which are then held together by the Word. And we can see something of this in the second letter of Peter in chapter 3, verse 5, which is worth reading. For they deliberately suppressed this fact that by the Word of God, heavens existed long ago, and an earth was formed out of water and by means of water, also under the influence of Stoic philosophy and perhaps mediated through the Jewish reception of Stoic philosophy at the time, as we saw in the case of Philo of Alexandria. In verse 18, he is the head of the body, the church, as well as the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself may become first in all. Now the tone here has changed. We have come somewhat down to earth, the head of the body, the church. So we're dealing then with the concrete reality. And Paul himself, the historical Paul, used the image of head and used the image of body, but actually not together. And the hymn here joins these images for the first time, perhaps under the influence of Hellenistic cosmology. And the term body, soma in Greek in verse 18a, could originally have been or could have been understood as a reference to the cosmos, which is common in Philo of Alexandria and Hellenistic Judaism. And so the second edition, the word church, the writer then specifies by this that he understands Christ's headship as being over the church as the body. And Philo himself used head for the logos as the ruling principle of the cosmos, which he also saw as a body. So strong influence here of Jewish reception of Greek philosophy in the language used to describe Christ and his role in the church. As we saw, the Paul of the Undisputed Letters also uses language of body. But here, the church is not simply a church, that's to say, a concrete community of individual believers, but the church as the universal assembly of believers. It's also worth pausing on the word beginning. In Greek, that is arche, which means both beginning in time and beginning in sense of authority. And firstborn is back here. This is first in time, also in authority, but also the origin of resurrection, the firstborn from the dead. So the writer is saying that Christ was part of creation, firstborn, and then part of redemption, firstborn from the dead. So the writer is bringing together creation and salvation. We might notice that the word all is present in every verse in this hymn, occurring 8 times in 6 verses in the original Greek. Colossians 19, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in the Son. Now it must be said here that the Greek is a little less clear than that. It's somewhat laconic, and translators have to add words to make the meaning clear. So I'll read the Greek to you. The Greek says, Hoti enauto eudokezen pan to plero makatoikastai, which means literally, for in him it pleased all the fullness to dwell. And so you have to add either it pleased God or it pleased all the fullness of God to dwell to make sense of the passage. The addition of the word Son is justified by he delivered us from the power of darkness and transferred us the kingdom of his beloved Son in verse 11. Fullness is a very important word in wisdom literature and also here in Colossians. God is the one who fills all things, and wisdom itself is said to fill all things rather than to be full of God himself. And fullness may here be the language of the opponents of the letter who are looking for a fuller or more exciting version of Christianity. And the writer is saying such fullness cannot be found apart from Christ, in whom the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And finally, and through him to reconcile all things to himself by making peace through the blood of his cross, through him, whether things on earth or things in heaven. Sometimes from the previous verse, scholars try to pin the dwelling on baptism or resurrection. That's probably too precise, really. So God is still the subject from verse 19 here, and through him to reconcile to himself all things. The background is some kind of original harmony has been disturbed and needs to be restored. We don't have to go back into the full Western doctrine of original sin to see that. Already in Judaism at the time, there was some sense that something was wrong from the beginning of creation. Reconcile is, of course, a Pauline term, but Paul himself uses the simple form of the verb to reconcile, say, for instance, in Romans 5:10 or 2 Corinthians 5:18. Here we have an intensification, the compound form, found only here in Colossians and in Ephesians 2:16. What are the links between the letters? Himself there, it refers to either God or Christ, perhaps to Christ. Making peace takes a cosmic view of the events of salvation, which if you were looking only at the cross would hardly make sense. But once you include the resurrection, then that's already cosmic in its intent. And so a cosmic view is possibly built on the understanding of resurrection as to do with end time and beginning time. The blood of his cross is not an expression found in the undisputed letters of Paul. This is a new expression, making the events of salvation very, very concrete with the crucifixion of Jesus. Finally, to reconcile all things. So the all is expanded again in verse 20c, towards the end, all things, whether things in heaven or things on earth. So the heavenly powers are in a position of emphasis here, coming last in the list, and there is no further reconciliation or appeasement of these powers required. It has all been achieved in Christ. And this is the foundation for the writer's response to the Colossian heresy that we saw in the other presentation together. So, what have we here? The writer is writing against a spirituality which distorts or leaves out the cross and resurrection, possibly the opponents. The writer is against the return to legalistic observances, what he would dismiss as self-help asceticism, which get you nowhere. And the bridge between Jesus of Nazareth and the cosmic Christ, the Pantocrator, is the cross and the resurrection. And then later in the letter, the writer does admit that there is something to be made up. He talks about what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ, which really means not something that's lacking, but to make that a reality in the present moment. And acknowledging the needs of those who are attracted to the heresy, he talks about our life being hidden with Christ in God. So there's a journey to be made, and there's more to be known. And he also says transformation is possible in him, and of course it goes on. It's not over and never done. So we come to the close. So some questions for reflection. A friend has asked you to give the gist of this presentation. What would you say? How would you summarize it? Is there anything in the hymn which spoke especially to me? Or perhaps, have I felt the need of reconciliation as found in the Colossian hymn? I'm going to ask you to do a peculiar task, which is this. Take out your study Bible, whichever one you have, the Oxford Annotated the HarperCollins Study Bible, the New Jerusalem Study Bible, or the Jewish Annotated New Testament, also excellent. Go to Colossians 1, 15-20, and slowly follow up the references in the footnotes. That will definitely enrich your reading. Give time to each one of them slowly. And these resonances can greatly enrich our reading of this very short, compressed, compact passage. Our next step is we're going to leave Colossians behind and go on to Ephesians. And once more, there'll be an introduction to Ephesians, looking at context, layout, authorship, and message. And in particular, I'm going to spend time in the next presentation offering a detailed comparison with Colossians, and there are handouts on the website to guide us through that. So thanks very much for your patience going through this rather long presentation. I hope it has opened up or polished the text, which is very, very rich and very, very powerful. And this is part of the breviary, so it's prayed very regularly in the church. So thanks very much, and we'll see you at the next presentation.